Hello and welcome to the Timberland Investor. One of the most common questions a landowner might have, or somebody who's just curious, is how much exactly is a standing tree worth? And we're going to discuss that today, but it comes with one caveat, and that is that the only way to know for sure what a tree is worth is to count the money in your hand after you have received it. But the answer to questions being unknowable has never really stopped mankind from asking those questions before, so we're not going to let it stop us today. We're going to get into everything you need to know, how to measure it, and the tools you might need, so stick with me. Alright, so to estimate the value of a tree, we're going to need two things. The first is an estimate of the volume of that tree. The second is an estimate of the per unit value of that volume. So I thought what we'd do today is we'd take this red oak here, and we'd measure those two things and estimate its value. And then once we kind of discuss that and some of the nuances therein, you can have the tools to estimate the value of any tree that you have on your property. We're going to start with getting an estimate of the volume of this tree. And actually, that's not quite technically accurate. We're going to get an estimate of the yield of that tree. And that's because volume in forestry is measured in several different ways. There's cords, there's tons, there's cubic feet, cubic meters. And then there's something that's really more common, especially for higher value timber, and that is board feet. And what board feet are is the estimate of the lumber yield of a single tree. So a board foot is described as a unit of lumber, rough and green, so it's not planed and it's still moist from having been cut recently. And it measures 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch, so it's a square. So when we're measuring the board feet of a tree, we are estimating the number of these hypothetical units that a tree can produce. So that's how we're going to be trying to figure out the value of this tree. And for lower value trees, like for pulpwood or firewood, you'd be dealing in cords or tons. But those trees are, well, low value, so they're not that exciting. We're not going to be discussing it today. I do have another video, though, on how you can estimate the cordwood volume of a pulpwood tree. I'll link to that in the description. What we need to do to estimate the board foot volume of this tree is we need to use something called a log rule, which is an equation. In its original state anyway, it's an equation that can be used to derive the board foot volume of a fallen log. But in the 40s, these equations were adapted to be able to estimate the value of standing timber. So while there are several log rules that you can use, and in fact even there are some private proprietary log rules that some larger timber companies use, there's really three main ones. And those would be the Scribner, Doyle, and International. The Scribner is actually based on diagrams of the likely yield of a log. The Doyle is kind of used for larger timber, and it might underestimate the yield of smaller logs. And then the one we're going to be using today, that's my personal favorite, is the International quarter-inch kerf rule, which estimates an amount of kerf in the log. That's the amount taken out by the saw blade that's turned into sawdust, and also it accounts for taper in the log. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that log rule, and it might not be standard for your area, but because this is just kind of a quick and dirty estimate, it shouldn't really make that much of a difference unless you're using this for commercial uses, which you shouldn't. So let's go from there. Okay, so we know we're going to estimate the board foot volume. We know we're going to do so using a log rule. What's next? Well, I have a fancy little device here that I've been swinging around since the start of the video called a Biltmore stick. If you have one of these, great. You probably don't if you're watching this video because you know how to use it. But have no fear, I'm going to give you everything that you need from this handy little tool, and actually even better resources than this can provide. All right, so what this is if you look, there's several different markings on this stick. These numbers in the middle are actually the log rule. These markings here are to estimate diameter, and here, these on the side, are to estimate the number of logs in the tree. So basically what I'm going to do is you stand from 66 feet away and you hold it up like this, right? And you use those markings and you estimate how much of that tree is usable. Each marking represents a 16-foot log. So let's say I'm standing 66 feet away from the tree, and I look and say, oh, right about that 2 mark, which is 2 16-foot logs, that tree starts to get very poor quality and can't be used for timber anymore, or for saw timber. So there's 2 usable 16-foot logs in that tree. All right, so we go back and then there's the markings for diameter. So you take the diameter of the tree, and let's just say hypothetically that there are 2 logs and it's a 20-inch diameter tree. Okay, so you have the markings here again, and if you see right here, there's 1 16-foot, 2 16, 3, 4, the number of logs. And so each number corresponds with the number of logs given its diameter on the top. So what did I say? We'll just say it's 20 inches, and there are 2 16-feet logs. So there is 295 board feet in that tree. All right, so if you don't have a Biltmore stick, don't worry, because in the description I'm going to link to this table right here, which is actually the same log rule that's written on this Biltmore stick, but it also has the addition for 0.5 logs, which allows you to estimate the number of 8-foot logs, so it's actually a little more helpful than what's on this stick. And there's some Biltmore sticks that I think have the 0.5 option as well. Don't quote me on that, this is kind of a cheapie. And the second thing is these markings. Each one of these markings is exactly 6 inches apart. So if you have a yardstick or even a ruler, although that's limited to 2 logs, a tape measure, and you hold it out and you're 66 feet away from the tree, and I think it's 25 inches from your eye, we'll go over that in a minute though, every 6-inch increment is going to represent 1 16-foot log. So that's how you can do it with your own tools. You know, like I said, that table will be in the description, and then you can just take any sort of measurement tool that measures in inches. Every 6-inch increment is a 16-foot log. Every 3 inches is an 8-foot log. It's that simple. All right, now let's do it for real on this tree. So the process I just described is fairly straightforward and simple, but the real nuance comes from how many logs you determine are actually in the tree. That's a question of what would be called merchantability. How many of these logs can actually be sold as saw timber, which is a log usable for, you know, sawn lumber? And that's a fairly high grade. You can't just take any piece of wood and make lumber out of it. It can't have too many knots, it can't have rot, or, you know, there's an allowance for rot, but it can't have too much rot. Cracks, wounds, anything like that is going to impede on the ability of that piece of timber to be used for lumber. So it's kind of a little bit of a guess, but I'm going to show you how you can kind of take an estimate to that. So the first thing to keep in mind is that merchantability is not an objective thing. It's entirely dependent on the market. Some mills, like where I come from, they're very large mills and they're a little picky, and so a piece of a log rather has to be fairly nice to be used even for the lower grade stuff. However, if you are sawing your own logs, if you have a buddy that has a portable sawmill, and if you're selling slabs for people to make coffee tables, there's way more allowance to that. In addition to that, there are certain species, especially black walnut, that if you have a poor quality stem, that's okay because it's kind of expected for that species of tree. So it's kind of difficult to really decide that, especially if you don't have much experience, but you got to ask yourself exactly, what is this log going to be used for? Who is it going to? And if it's going to a, you know, established commercial mill, you can bet that there's going to be stricter standards. If you're selling it to a buddy or you're sawing it yourself, it's, you know, kind of up to you. So let's take, for example, this maple right here. Now on the surface, this maple looks all right. You know, it's straight, it's large, it should have a lot of volume in it. But only about, I don't know, maybe 8 feet up, you got this big ring of old branches and knots, and then you have, if you can see it, there's a cavity that shows that there's rot that probably extends all the way through this first log. And if you go up higher, you got to look through the entire tree to see what there is, because sometimes halfway up the tree it starts being okay, but in this case it's just as bad. Now, like I was saying earlier, if you're sawing slabs for kind of a home project or something like that, sometimes you like that character and that's all right. But I think in this situation, for most applications, especially commercial applications, this tree, for all practical purposes, is going to have 0 log material. Now this is the oak tree that we're going to be measuring in a second here, but if you look, there's really nothing wrong with it. The only thing that you might say about it, which definitely is a sort of problem, is there's sweep, but that's not detrimental. That sweep over the entire length of the bowl is not too much of a problem. You can cut the logs in such a way that the mills will accept that just fine. And going all around the tree, there's really nothing until you get way up to the top, which I can't zoom in that far, but you can see there's a dead branch on two sides there. So this tree has quite the height before you get to the point where it can no longer be used for saw timber. Above that point, you know, it would be sold as pulp. So I think, you know, the question is, where's that line? That's a tough one. As I said, it's going to be entirely dependent on really what your situation is, what the tree is going to be sold for, etc. But I think a good rule of thumb is you want the log to be clear on three sides. So if there's a branch on one side, that's not necessarily too much of a problem. You want sweep to be limited. I'm not going to give any sort of hard and fast rules, but you know, you can kind of use your common sense on that one. And any rot, there are actually deductions you can make if there's rot present or rot that's likely. But you know, I think for our purposes here today, which again, just a quick and dirty estimate, understanding that there's no way to truly know the answer to this question, we should keep rot to almost zero. Now, if there's butt rot that seems to clear up as the tree goes on, you know, you can just hold your stick above that point and measure from that point up. But in general, if the tree is evidently rotten from the outside, you know, there's holes in it that looks like an owl would be sitting in there in like a children's book, that's a no-go. So the first thing we're going to do is measure the diameter. Now actually, this is kind of a whole process in itself. There are multiple ways to do it. You can do it with just kind of a soft, like tailor's tape measure. You can do it with specialized tools like a D-tape. Again, I'm going to leave a link in the description to an article I wrote about that and a video I made about that. However, with the Biltmore stick, what I'm going to be using today, there's actually kind of a cool, I had shown you it previously, but it is a graduated, they're not all the same distance, a graduated estimator, I guess you'd call it, to visually estimate the diameter. So what you do is you hold it 25 inches from the eye, excuse me, and hold the end towards the end of the stick towards the visual end from where your perspective is, and then you just measure the visual end of the log from the other side, and in this instance it gives me a reading of 24 inches. The accuracy is probably not as great as using other tools, but again, you know, we're just doing a quick estimate, so it works just fine and it's pretty handy and convenient. Alright, so the next step is to use this to estimate the number of logs. Now, what you have to do, like I said before, is walk 66 feet away. You can measure that out manually, you can pace that out. For most adult males, you know, every 2 steps you take is going to be about 5 feet, so you can use that to estimate the distance. And then you hold this 25 inches from your eye, and here's the key. You have to hold the bottom of whatever you're using, whether it's a ruler or whatever, about 1 foot off the ground, because you're going to account for the stump height. So you hold it out and you visually align that with the top of the stump, and you go up the tree and see at what point, like we talked about before, it becomes too poor quality to use for saw timber. And in the case of this red oak, which is pretty good quality, aside from that sweep, which is really the only defect, I'd give it an entire 3 logs. So there are 3 16-foot logs in this tree. That's pretty good. Now let's see what that corresponds to in terms of board foot volume. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up that table that I had earlier. We said we had a 24-inch diameter tree, so it's 24 inches, and there are 3 16-foot logs. So if you look on the chart, that gives us 605 board feet of likely yield from this tree. Excellent, perfect. So we're half done. Well, in terms of effort, we're well past half done. The next part is to estimate the price of that volume. You know, how much would we get paid for the volume of that tree? And really what you have to understand is that every tree is going to have 3 different tiers of prices depending on its point in the supply chain. The first, which is the most basic, is stumpage. Stumpage is the price a landowner is going to receive from a logger for the right to harvest standing timber. This is, I think, most fairly the price of or the value of a standing tree, because it's in its weakest state it's in its lowest, the lowest point of value in that value chain is going to be when it's standing timber, because it hasn't had any processing, no transport, etc. So the stumpage value is really the true value. After that, you're going to have the log prices, which are the value of the delivered logs to the mill. So the logs after they've been cut, harvested, processed, and delivered to the mill's yard, that's the log price. And then finally, of course, you have the lumber prices. So, you know, the price, the board foot price of lumber for that particular species, you know, how much is that worth? And that's kind of more the potential value of the tree. It might be of interest if you are, you know, small sawmill operator or something like that. For most people, probably not the case. So we're just going to stick to the stumpage value. So what is the stumpage value of this tree? You probably guessed it, it's going to depend. Stumpage is especially tricky. It's not an open market. It's usually a closed bid system, and it's going to vary depending on the site. It's going to vary depending on the region, the market, etc. I have a whole article about all the things that can affect stumpage value. I'm going to link to that in the description. But long story short, the quality of your timber, the terrain, the distance from the mill, because of course the transportation cost has to be taken into account. The logger is paying you for the right to harvest that timber. They have responsibility afterwards. So of course it's going to depend on an awful lot, and it's especially going to depend on the species. But luckily every state, well, not every state, that's not true at all. A lot of states kind of keep data on average stumpage prices to try to keep the market as open and fair as possible, and just for, you know, useful data for landowners. And I've kind of compiled a whole list of resources for the states that do that. Once again, link in the description. I live in Maine. This is Androscoggin County, so I'm going to reference the Maine stumpage price reports and look at the data for red oak. And I'm going to pull it up right here. So in the case of the Maine stumpage reports, you're going to have it broken down by region, species, product, and it's going to give you a max, min, and average. Now here's one thing to keep in mind. You know, you might be tempted to say, oh, well, it's a really nice tree. This is, you know, veneer quality, which is the highest grade. I'm going to go for the veneer price. But we're not, that would be true maybe if you're scaling logs individually, but we're scaling a tree. We're looking at the potential board foot volume in those logs and the value of those logs. And what's going to be the case with nearly every tree is the best logs are probably going to be on the bottom, and then they're going to decrease in value as you get to the top. So you're going to be having a minimum value log and maybe a maximum value log. It's best just to use the average, or if you want to be conservative, use the minimum. But the probability of an entire tree being veneer quality is almost zero. So let's just go with the average for now. And as we can see, the average value in stumpage for red oak in this area is $262 per MBF, which stands for 1,000 board feet. So what we have to do is, you know, we only got 605, I think it was, board feet in that tree, so that's not quite 1,000 MBF. So we have to multiply by 0.605 times 262. That gives us a final answer of $158. That might not sound like much, but you have to remember it's just one tree. If you had an entire, you know, acre of those trees, a property that was just chock full of them, it's, you know, it's plausible to have 150 trees per acre of trees of that quality, and then you'd be talking about, what, $23,000 per acre? That's not a bad deal by any means. Now, how likely is that to have that many high quality trees on your property? Well, it depends on previous management, it depends on your area, it depends on a lot of things. But it can definitely go to show you the potential value in timberland properties and the importance of long-term management. All right, that's all for now. Hopefully that helps you understand the process a little bit. Of course, like I said, it's an unknowable question, and the only way to know for sure is when you actually are paid and you have the money in your hand, and then you'll know. But just estimating standing timber, it's a whole practice in itself, and it's hard to know or really get the nuances right unless you've had experience, but that's okay. I'm a big fan of landowners and, you know, non-professionals kind of building those skills and that awareness anyway, because as I just kind of showed with the math we did just then, if you understand the potential value in your property, there's a lot more incentive to manage it properly and to really put effort and foresight into that. So big proponent of that, and really that's what this channel is all about. That's what my website is all about. Don't forget, if you had questions about any of that, resources in the description, you can pull them up out in the field. Makes it a lot easier. So give those a look if you need to. And I'm I'm fairly new to YouTube if you haven't noticed, so if you found this video useful, I'd really appreciate you subscribing, liking, leaving a comment. I'd love to do some great stuff with this channel in the future, and you know, building that base up really helps me do so. So until next time, see you later.